It was one of those slow Saturdays that seemed to stretch out endlessly. The kind of day you don't want to waste. Charlie, my 19-year-old nephew, had called me earlier to ask if I wanted to grab coffee. And honestly, I couldn't remember the last time we'd spent much time together. It wasn't like we'd drifted apart. He had just started college, gotten into a few new activities, and grown up, I guess. I was busy with work and trying to juggle life in general, so it was nice to have some time to catch up. We met up at the usual spot, a little cafe on the corner of the street where we always went when he was younger. It seemed like the right place to sit and chat for a while. The weather was perfect. Sunny, warm, but not hot, and we talked about everything and nothing. It was so easy, like it used to be when he was just a kid. He was telling me about his classes, how he'd joined some new clubs, all the typical stuff. But there was something different about the way he was talking. His voice was deeper, more confident. And when he laughed, it wasn't the same silly, adolescent giggle I remembered. There was a maturity to it now. For a while, I just tried to focus on the conversation, but my mind kept drifting. Charlie wasn't that little boy I used to babysit. I mean, I knew he was growing up, but today, more than ever, it hit me just how much he'd changed. He was a man now, and it felt strange, like I was finally seeing him for the first time as something other than my nephew. He had grown taller than me, which I hadn't really noticed until he stood up to grab a napkin. I'd always thought of him as a little guy, at least in my head. But now he was standing there, looking strong, broad-shouldered, and, well, just a lot more mature. His face was sharper, the faint baby fat of his youth replaced by the beginning signs of a strong jawline. And his arms, God, his arms were muscular, no longer the scrawny limbs of the boy I used to know. I felt this odd tension in the air, and for the first time, I realized how different he looked. I quickly shook myself out of my thoughts. It was crazy to be thinking about him this way. He was my nephew. But as we walked back to my apartment, something lingered in the back of my mind, like I couldn't quite shake the image of him. Was it just me? Or was there something else there? When we got inside, we just hung around for a bit. I told him I'd probably take a shower and change, and he was fine with that. He was sitting on the couch, casually scrolling through his phone as I made my way to the bathroom. I didn't think much of it at the time, just the usual routine. I figured I could quickly get dressed and then we'd maybe order in some food and watch a movie, just like old times. But as I reached for a towel, my foot slipped on the rug. It wasn't a big deal, just one of those stupid things that happen when you're in a hurry. But I lost my balance for a second. The towel I had wrapped around me fell, and before I could catch it, there I was, standing completely exposed, just a few feet away from the bathroom door. My heart stopped. My body went rigid with surprise, and I turned my head to see Charlie standing there, his wide eyes fixed on me. I could feel my face go crimson, my stomach flipping with the worst kind of panic. "Oh my God, Charlie!" I gasped, grabbing the towel and holding it tightly to my chest, trying to cover myself. I didn't mean... But the words seemed to stumble out of my mouth. There was a brief silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I could tell from the way he quickly looked away and backed out of the room that he hadn't meant to see me like that. But as he turned his back, I caught a glimpse of something on his face. It wasn't shock or embarrassment. It was something else, something unfamiliar. He stammered an apology, his voice cracked, and he practically ran out of the room. I stood there, frozen in place, trying to steady my breath. I had just seen my nephew, my 19-year-old nephew like that, and now he'd seen me. But what was worse, I felt this strange sensation crawl up my spine. That fleeting moment, those few seconds when our eyes had met, made me realize something I wasn't ready to face. It wasn't just embarrassment that he felt. It was something deeper, and the way he had looked at me was different. My mind raced as I grabbed the towel, wrapping it around me, but the thoughts wouldn't leave me. I didn't even know what to think or how to process it. I had to shake it off. It was nothing, just a mistake. But that's not what my body told me. I finished getting dressed as quickly as I could, trying not to think about what had just happened. I could hear him out in the living room, probably pacing or trying to pretend it hadn't just happened. When I finally walked out, I saw him sitting there, his face still flushed, but he quickly looked away. I tried to act normal, like nothing had changed, but I couldn't ignore the tension in the room. It felt like a weight pressing down on both of us. I plastered a smile on my face and suggested we order pizza and watch a movie, but neither of us was really paying attention to what the other was saying. We sat there in silence for a while, the awkwardness thick between us. I couldn't shake the image of his face when he'd seen me. His eyes, wide with something I couldn't quite understand, and I couldn't get the thought out of my head, the feeling that something between us had shifted. He wasn't the kid I used to take care of. No, he was a man now, and I could see that more clearly than I ever had before. I tried to keep my focus, but the strange sense of unfamiliarity lingered, and for the first time, I wasn't just thinking of Charlie as my nephew. I was seeing him as something else entirely, and I couldn't deny it. He wasn't the boy I had raised. He had become a man, and that realization hit me hard. It was impossible to pretend otherwise. What was happening to me? To us? The next day, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened the night before. The image of Charlie's surprised face when he'd seen me, it just wouldn't leave my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, there he was, standing there, looking at me with those wide eyes, frozen for a moment that felt much longer than it actually was. I tried to tell myself that it was just a stupid accident. He hadn't meant to see me like that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that something had shifted between us. And it wasn't just the awkwardness of that moment. It was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to confront. I found myself looking at Charlie differently the next time we spoke, as if my perception of him had changed overnight. Gone was the awkward teenage boy who used to fumble through conversations with me. Instead, he seemed older, more self-assured. There was a calm confidence in his voice when we talked, the kind of maturity that came from experience, not just age. His shoulders were broader now, his posture more upright, and he no longer slouched when he stood or sat. He carried himself like someone who knew exactly who they were. I was suddenly aware of every little detail about him, the way his t-shirt stretched over his chest, how the veins in his arms looked more defined now. His hair had grown out a bit too, no longer the messy mop it used to be, and I couldn't help but notice how it framed his face, making his jawline sharper, more chiseled. I couldn't even look at him without feeling my heart flutter in a way that was completely wrong. The dynamic between us had changed, but I couldn't tell if he had noticed it too. Every time we interacted, there was this pull, a quiet tension that hummed just under the surface, like something waiting to be acknowledged. And it scared me. More than I wanted to admit, it terrified me. We spent the next few days together, mostly just hanging out at my place, and the air between us was thick with this unspoken understanding. Charlie seemed more aware of me than he ever had been before. The little glances, the lingering touches when we passed each other, the way his eyes followed me when I walked across the room. He never did that before. I could feel his gaze on me, and it sent a wave of heat through my chest. It was as if everything we had shared in the past was now overshadowed by this strange, new connection that neither of us knew how to navigate. He was always respectful, of course. He didn't act like he was trying to cross any boundaries, but it was clear he was testing the waters. He would stand a little too close when we talked, his breath warm against my skin, and I couldn't help but notice how his lips would part slightly when he spoke to me. His voice sounded deeper now, even more compelling than it had been before. Sometimes, he would smile at me in a way that made me feel like there was something unspoken between us, a secret that we were both holding on to, pretending it didn't exist. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but the truth was, I couldn't deny the change. Charlie was no longer the kid I once knew. He had grown up, and not just physically. There was a depth to him now, something that made me question everything I thought I knew about him, and about myself. I noticed, too, how he seemed to notice me in ways that felt almost too intentional. The way he would meet my eyes a little longer than usual, the way his body would shift when I entered the room, as if he was trying to get a better look at me. It wasn't like before, when he would barely glance at me. Now I felt like he was paying attention to every little detail. And every time our eyes met, there was this undeniable electricity in the air that I couldn't ignore. It wasn't just me noticing him more. He was noticing me in a different way too. And the way he looked at me sometimes, there was something in his gaze that I couldn't quite place. It wasn't just familial warmth or affection. It was something else. Something dangerous, maybe. Something that stirred a longing deep inside me. I tried to keep my distance, to avoid any more of those moments where we might get too close. But it was getting harder. The pull between us was becoming undeniable, and no matter how hard I tried to avoid it, I couldn't help but wonder if Charlie felt it too. And the worst part? I think he did. I could feel it in the way his lips curled into a smile when our hands brushed, in the way his eyes would soften when he looked at me. He was holding back, but I knew he could sense the same thing I did. The shift. It was there, and it was growing stronger every day. It happened one night after dinner. The house was quiet, save for the sound of the occasional car driving by outside. The tension that had been building between Charlie and me over the past few days was thicker than ever, and I could feel it pressing in on me, suffocating me. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the clink of forks against plates the only sound in the room. I could hardly eat, my stomach twisted in knots. Every time I glanced up, I saw Charlie looking at me, really looking at me, his eyes intense, almost searching. For a long while, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, charged with something neither of us was willing to address. Finally, it was Charlie who broke the quiet, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the internal struggle he was clearly going through. "Aunt Tess," he began, his voice soft but sure, "I need to talk to you about something." His words hung in the air, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. I tried to act calm, but my heart started to race. I had no idea what was coming, but I had a sinking feeling that whatever it wasn't going to be easy. I put my fork down slowly, trying to keep my composure. "What's on your mind, Charlie?" I asked, trying to sound nonchalant, though my hands had started to tremble slightly. Charlie hesitated for a moment, his gaze dropping to the table before meeting mine again. I don't know how to say this. I've been thinking about it for a while, and I just can't ignore it anymore." He let out a deep breath, as though gathering his courage. "I think I have feelings for you, Tess." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. My head spun, my thoughts scattered in 1,000 directions. I felt the weight of the confession crush down on me, but I couldn't process it fast enough. I wanted to say something, to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but my voice seemed to fail me. I could only stare at him, my mouth slightly open, struggling to find the words. Charlie didn't wait for me to say anything. His eyes were filled with a mixture of uncertainty and desperation, as though he had been holding this in for far too long. "I know this is wrong, Tess. I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but I can't help how I feel. I just thought you should know." I could feel my pulse racing, my heart pounding in my chest. This was insane, I told myself. I was his aunt. This wasn't something we should even be talking about. But despite my shock, there was a part of me, the part I was trying so hard to ignore, that was listening to him. "You're not making me uncomfortable, Charlie," I said softly, though my voice felt tight. This is a lot to process." I paused, trying to steady myself. "You're young. You're still figuring things out." "I know," he said quickly, almost apologetically. "I'm not asking you to feel the same way, Tess. I just needed you to know. I don't expect anything. I don't want to make this weird between us, but I couldn't keep pretending like everything was normal when it's not. Not anymore." There was so much pain in his voice, so much honesty, that I found it impossible to dismiss what he was saying. His words hung in the air between us, and for the first time in a long time, I realized just how much he had grown up. He wasn't the awkward teenager I had known. He was a man, and he was standing before me, confessing something so raw, so vulnerable. My chest tightened. "Charlie, I stopped myself, realizing I didn't even know what to say. What was I supposed to say? That I felt the same way? That I didn't? Or that I wasn't sure? But there was something inside me that felt like I might be dangerously close to crossing a line I had no business even considering. "I'm sorry," Charlie said, his voice trembling slightly. "I didn't mean to make this harder. He paused, looking down at his hands before standing up, a look of regret clouding his face. "Forget I said anything, okay? I thought you should know." But even as he tried to retreat, I could see the hurt in his eyes. I could feel the weight of his words sinking in, and a part of me, the part I didn't want to acknowledge, understood. "Charlie," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He turned toward me, his eyes wide. "I'm not saying it's okay," I started, unsure if I even believed the words I was about to say. "But I need time to think. I need time to figure this out." Charlie nodded, his expression unreadable. "I understand. I just needed to be honest with you." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the chaos of my own thoughts. I sat there in silence, the weight of his confession pressing down on me. The room felt too small, too suffocating. The air between us had shifted irrevocably, and I knew nothing would ever be the same again. I wasn't sure what to do with the feelings that had suddenly risen inside me, or what this meant for us moving forward. But one thing was certain. We were standing at a crossroads, and I wasn't sure which path we would take. After Charlie's confession, the days felt like they were stretching out into infinity. It was as if every moment I spent near him was a delicate balancing act, teetering on the edge of something that could completely unravel. I couldn't stop thinking about the weight of what he had said, the feelings he had admitted to, and the way he had looked at me, vulnerable yet determined. He hadn't asked for anything, but in a way he'd already given me something I couldn't ignore. I tried to put it out of my mind, told myself that it was just a passing phase for him, a fleeting moment of confusion that would eventually fade. He was young, and I was his aunt, and nothing could ever come of it. But the more I tried to suppress the thoughts, the stronger they became. I couldn't look at him the same way anymore. When he was around, it was like an invisible thread connected us, pulling tighter every time our eyes met. I noticed the way he moved differently now. There was a confidence in his posture that hadn't been there before. The boyish awkwardness that used to define him seemed to be gone, replaced by someone whose every step exuded a kind of quiet strength. I caught myself wondering how that strength would feel if it was directed toward me. I could feel my body responding to him in ways I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. There were moments when our hands brushed against each other, or when he'd lean in just a little too close, and I had to force myself not to recoil, to pretend that I didn't feel a warmth spread through me that I had no business feeling. I tried to keep my distance, but he was everywhere, and no matter how much I told myself it was wrong, my mind betrayed me. Each time I saw him, the guilt gnawed at me. This wasn't supposed to happen. I wasn't supposed to look at him like that. I wasn't supposed to feel drawn to him. But that guilt, the part of me that wanted to keep everything in its proper place, was always overshadowed by something else. A longing, a desire. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. But it was there, and it was undeniable. There were nights when I would lie awake, my thoughts a whirlpool of confusion. I thought about him, and I felt my pulse quicken. I could almost hear his voice in my ear, see his eyes the way they had looked at me that night when he confessed. It wasn't just the physical attraction, though that was powerful enough. It was the way he saw me now, the way I felt seen by him. He made me feel desirable in a way I hadn't in years. But then the guilt would return, heavy and suffocating, reminding me of who I was, of who he was. He was my nephew, and I was supposed to be the one to protect him, to guide him, not to fall into the same dangerous territory he was treading. Every time we were alone together, I found myself walking a tightrope, trying to maintain control, trying to push down the feelings that were bubbling up inside of me. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't let it go any further. But as much as I tried to tell myself that, the truth was harder to ignore with each passing day. One evening, I caught him looking at me across the room, and for a moment everything seemed to stop. There was something in his gaze, something raw, something that said he wasn't done with me, with us. He wasn't backing down. I wanted to say something, to tell him that this was a mistake, that we needed to stop before it went too far. But instead, I just turned away, as if pretending it wasn't there would make it go away. I was doing everything I could to keep my distance, but it was becoming harder and harder to fight the pull. Each conversation with him felt like a battle between what I wanted and what I knew was right. every touch, every lingering look, felt like it was slowly eroding the boundaries I had once set. I wanted to push him away, but I couldn't. And in some dark corner of my mind, a part of me didn't want to. The guilt weighed on me, but there was another feeling that was becoming impossible to ignore. The same desire that was growing inside of him, building between us with every passing day. Would I be able to hold on to the lines I had drawn for myself? Or would the temptation, the undeniable attraction, finally tip the scale and pull us both into something that neither of us could control? I didn't know the answer. All I knew was that I was losing control, piece by piece, and no matter how hard I tried to hold myself back, it felt like I was walking towards something that could change everything, something that neither of us was prepared for. Days passed, and the tension between Charlie and me grew more impossible to ignore. We were walking a tightrope, each of us pretending that things were normal, but the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. Every time I saw him, I could feel it, an undeniable shift, a subtle but intense force pulling at us both. It was as if something had changed in the very air around us. It had started small, but now it was inescapable. We were moving closer, and I couldn't seem to find a way to push it back. Charlie, for his part, seemed to be growing more confident with each passing day. He wasn't the boy I remembered. His shoulders were broader, his posture straighter. The subtle shifts in his demeanor, his smoldering glances, the way he leaned just a little too close when speaking to me, were no longer accidental. It was as if he was deliberately drawing me in, testing the limits of what I was willing to tolerate. At first, I tried to brush it off. I told myself he was just being playful, that his teasing was harmless. But I wasn't fooling anyone, not even myself. Each time we were alone together, I felt the weight of his gaze on me, his presence filling the space between us. He wasn't just looking at me anymore. He was looking through me, his eyes searching, calculating. It felt like he could see straight into my soul, and that feeling unsettled me more than anything else. What's worse, I couldn't help but notice how much more power he had over me now. The way he spoke to me had changed too. His voice had deepened, taken on a maturity that wasn't there before. There was a quiet authority in his tone, one that I hadn't known I was craving until it was there, softly commanding my attention. Every word, every laugh, every moment felt amplified. I could sense his awareness of the effect he was having on me, and as much as I wanted to deny it, I couldn't help but be drawn in. I caught myself lingering in moments I knew were dangerous, allowing the tension to build between us, when I should have been doing everything I could to diffuse it. But I didn't. There was something about him now, something irresistible, that I couldn't ignore. It was as if he was slowly pulling the strings, and I had no idea how to stop it. The worst part? I wasn't sure if I wanted to. There were moments when I found myself drawn to him in ways I never had before. He wasn't just my nephew anymore, he was a man, and I was feeling every inch of that transformation. My thoughts were becoming clouded, and each time I tried to rationalize my feelings, I was met with the harsh reality that it was becoming more and more difficult to distinguish between what was appropriate and what was not. Charlie had become more assertive. He began showing his affection in ways that were no longer subtle. Small touches, lingering glances, moments where our hands brushed against each other in a way that felt deliberate, not accidental. I could feel him testing me, pushing the boundaries of what we once had. And every time he did, I couldn't help but feel a growing sense of helplessness. He was taking control, and I was letting him. It was like he knew what he was doing. He knew the hold he had on me, and as much as I hated to admit it, I was falling into it. Each time we interacted, he would inch closer, and each time I tried to pull away, I found myself drawn back in, like a moth to a flame. I knew this was wrong. I knew it was dangerous. But there was a part of me that couldn't stop, couldn't walk away, no matter how much I tried to fight it. Charlie was no longer the teenager I had known. He was a man, and he was beginning to realize just how much power he had over me. I could feel it in the way he looked at me, in the way he moved when we were together. He wasn't just playing at something anymore. He was testing the waters, seeing how far he could push, and in some twisted way, I realized that I was letting him. The tables had turned. He was no longer the boy I needed to protect. He was the one who was pulling me in, and I wasn't sure how long I could keep pretending that I didn't want him to. Each time we spoke, I found myself losing more and more of the control I had worked so hard to maintain. There was no going back. We were both caught in something now, something that neither of us fully understood, but was slowly consuming us both. It was only a matter of time before we crossed that line, and I wasn't sure if I'd be able to stop it when it happened. It happened on a quiet evening, the kind where the world outside seemed so far away, and the only thing that mattered was the space between Charlie and me. The air was thick with tension, the kind that made it hard to breathe, hard to think clearly. We had spent the entire day together, laughter, quiet moments, some awkward glances exchanged. But as the sun began to set, it was impossible to deny what was between us any longer. There was no running from it. It had been building for days, maybe weeks. But now it was here, impossible to ignore. I could feel Charlie's presence before I even saw him. His footsteps, slow and deliberate, made my heart race. He was standing too close, his breath warm against my neck as he leaned in to speak, his voice low and husky. I didn't need to turn around to know that his eyes were on me, his gaze intense and unwavering. My skin prickled with awareness, and I could almost feel the weight of his stare on the back of my neck. We had crossed so many lines already, small touches, lingering glances, moments where we stood too close. But this was different. This was the moment we had been avoiding, the tipping point. I didn't know what made me turn to him then, or why my hand reached for his, but I knew that the world had shifted. The air between us was charged with something raw and desperate, something neither of us could control anymore. We were caught in a storm, and there was no turning back. When our eyes locked, there was no going back. I could see it in his eyes, a depth of longing, of something darker, something far more dangerous than either of us had ever dared acknowledge before. His hand moved to my face, fingers tracing the outline of my jaw, and for a split second, everything else disappeared. The world outside, the responsibilities, the rules, all of it vanished, leaving only the two of us. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, the strength in his touch, the rawness of his desire. It consumed me, and in that moment, I couldn't fight it anymore. I didn't want to. The pull between us was too strong, too overwhelming. He leaned in, and I knew what was coming, knew that once we crossed this line, we would never be able to go back to the way things were. But it didn't matter. Nothing mattered but the way he made me feel. The kiss was electric. It was everything. Desperate, hungry, full of need. I didn't even try to resist. Our lips collided, soft and urgent, as if we had been waiting for this moment forever. His arms wrapped around me, pulling me closer, and for a brief moment the world seemed to stop. There was nothing but him and me, the heat of our bodies pressing together, the overwhelming force of the emotions we had been ignoring. But as the kiss deepened, something inside me snapped. Reality flooded back, and with it, the crushing weight of what we had done, what we were doing. I pulled away, my breath ragged, my heart pounding. I couldn't look at him. I couldn't even breathe. "Charlie," I whispered, my voice trembling as I stepped back. "We can't. This isn't right." The words felt foreign on my tongue, but they were the only thing I could say. Charlie's face softened, his eyes searching mine, but there was no anger, no resentment, only understanding. He didn't say anything at first, just watched me, his chest rising and falling with every breath. Then quietly, almost as if he were speaking to himself, he murmured, "I know. But I can't pretend like it doesn't feel real, Tess." My heart dropped at his words. I knew what he was saying, and it scared me more than anything had in a long time. He wasn't confused. He wasn't uncertain. He knew what he felt, and that terrified me, because deep down, I knew I felt it too. The room felt smaller now, suffocating. I couldn't be here, not like this, not with him. But the truth was, I didn't know how to leave it behind. I didn't know how to undo what had already happened. This was it, the moment where everything changed. There was no going back. And as I walked away, feeling the weight of what we had just shared, I realized that we were both standing on the edge of something we didn't fully understand. But the truth was inescapable. The kiss, the way he looked at me, the way I felt, it was all real. And now, there was nothing left to do but face the consequences. The tension that had been simmering for so long had finally reached its breaking point, and I didn't know what would come next. But one thing was certain. We had crossed a line, and neither of us would ever be the same again.